Have you ever left a hangout feeling strangely exhausted, even though nothing bad happened? Maybe a friend made a small comment about your choice of outfit, or jokingly teased you for saying something they didn't like. At first, it seems harmless. You laugh it off, thinking they're just joking, but later, that remark lingers in your mind, shaping your self-perception and decisions. This is one of the quiet ways friends can manipulate you without you ever realizing it. Manipulation among friends isn't always dramatic or malicious. Often, it's subtle, woven into everyday interactions, and wrapped in care, concern, or humor. It's invisible because it's disguised as ordinary friendship, and that's exactly what makes it so powerful. Many of us don't notice it because we trust our friends deeply, assuming their intentions are always pure, and we fear labeling them as controlling or toxic. The reality, however, is that even the most well-meaning people can influence, bend, or control others without realizing the effects of their actions. Recognizing this is not about hatred or cynicism. It's about awareness and protecting your own mental and emotional space. Consider a real life example. A friend always insists on making plans, deciding where you go, what you eat, and who else can come along. At first, you think it's because they are enthusiastic, confident, or organized. Over time, however, you notice that your choices seem limited. You rarely voice what you want, and even when you do, your opinion is subtly ignored or dismissed. You might start feeling guilty for suggesting an alternative plan or choosing to do something independently. That guilt is the mechanism of subtle manipulation. It nudges you toward compliance without overt commands. Another classic example is the friend who constantly gives helpful advice. On paper, it seems supportive. They tell you which classes to take, which people to trust, or which habits to adopt. However, often these suggestions align more with their own interests or comfort rather than yours. Maybe they don't want you to succeed in a field that might overshadow them, or they simply want you to remain within their comfort zone. When you follow their advice, it feels like a choice, but in reality, your autonomy has already been subtly influenced. Manipulation doesn't always appear in words. Body language, tone, and social cues play a huge role. A friend rolling their eyes when you express excitement for a new opportunity, sighing when you disagree, or giving a faint smile that implies disappointment, are all signals that can shape your behavior without any explicit direction. Over time, your brain begins to avoid conflict or disappointment, not necessarily because you fear the person, but because your subconscious wants to maintain the balance of the friendship. In real life, I've seen countless cases where someone slowly loses confidence in decision-making simply because a close friend habitually undermines their choices with subtle gestures or sarcastic remarks. Another tool manipulators use is guilt. A friend might say, "After everything I've done for you," or "I thought you'd understand me by now." Such statements are often accompanied by a small favor, a sacrifice, or a shared secret that they remind you of. In my experience, people fall into this trap without realizing it, thinking, "I owe them for all they've done," even when the favor is minor or was given casually. Emotional debt becomes a powerful lever of influence. You begin to make choices not because they align with your own values, but because you feel you should reciprocate, and the line between kindness and manipulation blurs. Isolation is another common, yet often unnoticed, tactic. A manipulative friend might subtly discourage you from spending time with others, saying things like, "Are you sure you want to go there without me?" Or, "I don't think they really understand you." On the surface, it sounds caring, protective even. But in reality, this slowly restricts your social circle and creates dependency. Over time, you start valuing their opinions above everyone else's, not out of malice, but because they've shaped your environment to make you rely on them. I remember a college student whose best friend routinely made jokes about other friends being fake or selfish. Eventually, she avoided hanging out with anyone outside that friendship, believing her friend's perspective, even when it conflicted with her own instincts. This isn't dramatic abuse. It's subtle, insidious manipulation hidden behind concern and loyalty. Conditional affection is another mechanism. Have you noticed how some friends suddenly become distant, cold, or even passive-aggressive when you don't do what they want? Perhaps you chose to spend a weekend studying instead of attending a party they invited you to. Suddenly, their texts become short, their tone slightly sharp, or they hint at disappointment. Manipulation is often attached to emotional rewards. Your friend's attention, approval, or warmth becomes contingent on your compliance. And because these shifts are subtle, it's easy to blame yourself. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I should have gone with them. Over time, this pattern trains you to prioritize their desires over your own comfort, blurring the line between friendship and control. The psychology behind these behaviors helps explain why manipulation is so effective. One key principle is reciprocity. Humans instinctively feel obliged to return favors. A friend who gives small gifts, compliments, or support may unconsciously or intentionally create a sense of indebtedness. Over time, you find yourself agreeing to things you wouldn't otherwise, simply because you feel obligated to return their perceived kindness. Another principle is emotional contagion. Friends shape your emotional environment. If someone frequently expresses doubt, frustration, or superiority, it subtly affects how you feel, making you question your own choices or abilities. You might not even realize that your anxiety, guilt, or hesitation originates from their influence rather than the situation itself. Manipulators also exploit cognitive overload. Have you noticed how some friends present multiple, often conflicting, pieces of advice in a way that leaves you confused? When your mind is overloaded, it's easier to defer to them, thinking they know better. This can happen in group dynamics as well. If several friends give slightly different advice, you may gravitate toward the one who is most assertive or confident, allowing them to guide your decisions without confrontation. Gradual escalation compounds the effect. Manipulation is rarely sudden. A friend may start by teasing or making minor suggestions, and over time, escalate to influencing your major decisions, shaping your relationships, and even isolating you from other support systems. Because the process is gradual, you often accept behaviors as normal, unaware that your autonomy has been eroded. Early warning signs are subtle but detectable. For instance, do they frequently test your loyalty, expecting proof of friendship in ways that feel uncomfortable? Do they conveniently forget things that contradict their narrative, or apply rules to you but not themselves? Do you often feel guilt, anxiety, or obligation after interactions? In real life, I've seen people dismiss these as quirks or personality traits, only to realize years later that their emotional responses were conditioned by the patterns of subtle manipulation. Awareness is crucial. You don't have to accuse your friend or label them as toxic, but noticing patterns empowers you to make conscious choices. Awareness without hatred is a cornerstone of healthy boundaries. Observing patterns, reflecting on your feelings, and setting gentle limits are not acts of betrayal, they are acts of self-preservation. You can remain kind, polite, and supportive while ensuring your emotional independence. For example, if a friend habitually pressures you to change plans or decisions, learning to assertively say no even in small ways strengthens your boundaries. Emotional detachment, when practiced consciously, allows you to engage with friends without losing yourself. We often miss manipulation because trust clouds judgment. Manipulation mimics care. Fear of conflict discourages confrontation. And we internalize responsibility. We blame ourselves for discomfort or disagreement, thinking we overreacted or failed to understand. While the real pattern lies in repeated influence, subtle coercion, or conditional approval. Once recognized, these patterns can be addressed consciously, giving you the ability to preserve genuine friendships without surrendering your autonomy. Ultimately, manipulation in friendship is rarely obvious. It hides in advice, jokes, concern, and even kindness. It erodes self-confidence and freedom quietly, shaping decisions and behavior over time. Awareness, reflection, and boundary setting are your tools not to hate or cut off friends unnecessarily, but to reclaim control of your mind and choices. Recognizing these patterns is not a sign of cynicism. It is a step toward maintaining authentic, healthy, and balanced friendships. By understanding the hidden mechanics of influence, you can navigate friendships with clarity, protect your emotional well-being, and maintain relationships that are mutually respectful and nurturing. In the next part, we will explore specific tactics friends use in daily life, the behaviors that may seem innocent or even caring, but are often designed to influence your choices and subtly shape your actions. Real-life examples will guide us through understanding these methods and how to respond without breaking bonds or fostering resentment. In friendships, manipulation rarely announces itself. It creeps in through small, seemingly harmless behaviors that shape your actions and perceptions without your conscious awareness. One of the most common tactics is the art of subtle persuasion through casual influence. A friend may begin by making minor suggestions disguised as advice. For instance, you might mention wanting to try a new hobby or attend an event, and they respond with comments like, "I don't know if that's really your thing," or "Are you sure you want to do that alone?" At first, it feels like concern, but repeated over time, these remarks shape how you think about your own choices. You begin to doubt yourself, prioritizing their opinions over your own. In a real-life example, a young woman shared that her best friend consistently steered her away from joining clubs or workshops outside their immediate social circle, under the guise of keeping her safe. Eventually, she stopped exploring new opportunities entirely, not out of disinterest, but because her friend's subtle discouragement had conditioned her to question her own judgment. Another prevalent method is emotional blackmail. Manipulative friends often frame situations to make you feel guilty or responsible for their feelings. Phrases like, "I thought you cared about me," or "If you really were my friend, you would have done this," are common tools. In practice, this can look like a friend expressing disappointment over minor matters, such as you choosing to spend a day studying instead of hanging out, and framing it as a personal betrayal. One student recounted that whenever she declined a study session with her friend, the friend would post subtle social media hints suggesting she was being selfish or distant, even without direct confrontation. This created a lingering sense of obligation, nudging her toward compliance to maintain harmony. The manipulation works because it taps into natural human empathy and the desire to maintain relationships. We feel responsible for others' emotional well-being, even when it shouldn't be our burden. Subtle competition is another tool frequently employed by friends. Some manipulative individuals use one-upmanship to control self-esteem and confidence. They may present their achievements, possessions, or experiences in ways that implicitly diminish yours, often disguised as casual conversation or encouragement. For instance, a friend might respond to your promotion with, "Oh, that's nice, but I got that 6 months ago," or "I've already tried that. It's not as exciting as it seems." Real-life experiences show that these remarks, repeated over time, chip away at self-confidence. You start questioning the value of your own accomplishments or experiences, while your friend maintains subtle dominance over the social or emotional dynamic. This form of manipulation is particularly effective because it doesn't involve outright criticism. Instead, it quietly shifts your self-perception to align with their implicit hierarchy. Manipulative friends also exploit vulnerability. They observe your insecurities, fears, or past traumas and subtly use them to influence your choices. A classic scenario is a friend who frequently reminds you of past mistakes, framing them as cautionary tales that justify their guidance. For example, one person shared that her friend constantly referenced a prior failed relationship whenever she considered dating someone new, emphasizing how dangerous it could be. Over time, these reminders conditioned her to hesitate and overanalyze every decision, ultimately giving her friend indirect control over her personal life. This strategy works because it leverages trust and intimacy. You assume that the friend pointing out potential pitfalls has your best interests at heart, not realizing that repeated emphasis on fear or caution becomes a method of behavioral influence. Gaslighting is another subtle form of manipulation often found among close friends. Unlike dramatic or obvious lies, gaslighting is incremental and revolves around making you doubt your own memory, perception, or judgment. A friend might contradict things you remember clearly, suggest you are overreacting to situations, or reinterpret events in ways that make you question your perspective. Real-world examples abound. A college student described how her friend repeatedly denied promising to support her at an event, even though she had texts proving it. Over time, she began doubting herself, apologizing unnecessarily, and altering her plans to preempt perceived future conflicts. Gaslighting in friendships is insidious because it undermines your inner confidence, making you more dependent on the manipulator's version of reality. Another tactic is selective encouragement, where a friend praises certain behaviors while subtly criticizing or ignoring others. This creates a pattern where you unconsciously prioritize actions that receive approval. For example, a friend may lavish praise when you follow their suggestions or opinions but remain silent or slightly critical when you act independently. One real-life instance involved a young man whose friend encouraged him to take up a fitness routine only if he attended sessions together. Any attempt to train solo was met with comments about being lazy or not serious, which gradually conditioned him to align his habits with the friend's preferences. Over time, your autonomy diminishes, masked by the perception that you are simply being supported and guided. Manipulators also thrive on social leverage. They might subtly create situations that isolate you from other support networks. A friend may hint that other people don't understand you, are jealous, or have hidden motives, creating a sense of dependency. One woman described how her best friend frequently questioned her other friendships, suggesting that her other friends were insincere or untrustworthy. As a result, she began spending almost all her social time with this one friend, prioritizing their opinions and influence over her broader social circle. This gradual narrowing of perspective is a subtle yet powerful method of control, as it fosters emotional dependence without overt commands. Passive-aggressive behavior is another common manipulation tactic. Unlike open conflict, passive aggression expresses disapproval indirectly, often through sarcasm, backhanded compliments, or subtle withdrawal. A friend might joke about your choices, using humor to mask criticism, or withhold attention when displeased. Real-life examples include a student whose friend would give faint, sarcastic comments about her study methods while laughing it off as teasing. Although initially dismissed as harmless, the repeated pattern created anxiety and self-doubts, subtly guiding her decisions to avoid future jokes or critiques. Passive aggression is effective because it allows manipulators to influence behavior while maintaining plausible deniability. They can claim they were just joking if confronted. Another subtle tactic is playing the victim. Manipulative friends sometimes frame themselves as suffering or disadvantaged to elicit sympathy and compliance. They may recount exaggerated struggles or selectively highlight difficulties, making you feel obligated to respond or adjust your behavior. A personal example involves a friend who frequently shared stories of being overworked or stressed to persuade peers to prioritize her needs over others. Listeners, empathizing with her plight, often complied, altering plans or decisions to accommodate her. Over time, this repeated dynamic subtly shaped how the group behaved, granting her indirect control. Lastly, friendships can be manipulated through conditional loyalty and selective memory. A friend may conveniently forget promises, selectively recall events, or reinterpret shared experiences to reinforce their influence. For instance, one student described how a friend constantly referenced shared experiences to justify decisions or influence choices, while conveniently ignoring times she had supported or advised that same friend. This selective framing subtly reinforces dependency and compliance, making it seem like their guidance is consistent and trustworthy, even when it is self-serving. All of these tactics, subtle persuasion, emotional blackmail, one-upmanship, exploitation of vulnerability, gaslighting, selective encouragement, social leverage, passive aggression, playing the victim, and conditional memory work because they operate under the guise of care, humor, or shared interest. Awareness is essential to recognize these behaviors, not to hate or reject your friends, but to protect your autonomy and emotional well-being. In real life, people rarely employ all these tactics consciously. Often, these patterns emerge from insecurity, habit, or a desire to maintain influence. Understanding the mechanisms allows you to navigate friendships more consciously, set healthy boundaries, and preserve mutual respect without falling into patterns of subconscious control. Developing strategies to recognize manipulation as it happens is crucial to maintaining autonomy in friendships. Awareness alone isn't enough. You need actionable methods to respond in the moment without escalating conflict or creating resentment. One of the most effective approaches is cultivating self-reflection and emotional monitoring. For example, consider a situation where a friend repeatedly questions your choices or subtly undermines your confidence. Instead of reacting impulsively, take a moment to observe your emotional response. Ask yourself, why am I feeling guilty or anxious right now? Is this my choice, or is it influenced by their comments? A young woman shared that she started journaling after noticing her friends' frequent remarks about her career decisions. By writing down her thoughts and comparing them with the friends' statements, she recognized patterns of subtle influence she had previously ignored. This practice of mindful reflection allows you to separate your genuine feelings from the manipulative cues embedded in social interactions. Another practical strategy is setting clear boundaries in a way that is assertive but non-confrontational. Manipulative friends often thrive on ambiguity, exploiting uncertainty to influence your behavior. Real-life examples show that clearly stating limits can reduce their power without harming the relationship. For instance, a college student told her friend, "I appreciate your advice, but I'd like to make this decision myself." Initially, the friend tested her resolve, but with consistent repetition, the boundaries were respected. Boundaries can be small or large, deciding not to answer calls late at night, declining suggestions you're uncomfortable with, or choosing independent social activities. The key is consistency. The more you reinforce your limits, the less room there is for subtle manipulation to affect your choices. Communication strategies are equally important. Direct, calm, and honest conversations can diffuse manipulative dynamics while preserving the friendship. Suppose a friend uses guilt to influence your plans. Responding with statements like, "I understand you feel that way, but I need to prioritize my own responsibilities," acknowledges their feelings without surrendering your own autonomy. A real-life example involves a young man whose friend frequently used passive-aggressive comments to sway decisions. By responding neutrally and clearly stating his intentions, he minimized conflict and maintained control over his choices. The principle here is transparency. Expressing your perspective assertively signals that you are aware of manipulative tactics and are not willing to comply blindly. Observation and documentation also serve as powerful tools. Keeping track of recurring patterns can make manipulation visible and easier to counteract. For example, a woman noticed that her friend repeatedly discouraged her from attending events without them. She began keeping a private log of these interactions, noting dates, situations, and the subtle tactics used. Over time, the pattern became undeniable, allowing her to approach the friend calmly and set boundaries with confidence. This practice does not mean holding grudges or plotting confrontation. It simply equips you with clarity about recurring behaviors, preventing emotional confusion or self-blame. Another practical method is diversifying your support system. Manipulative friends often create dependency by subtly isolating you or questioning your other relationships. Strengthening ties with a broader circle of friends or mentors reduces vulnerability to influence. Real-life experiences show that individuals who maintain multiple social connections are less likely to be swayed by conditional loyalty or selective encouragement. Even casual interactions with supportive acquaintances can provide perspective and reassurance, reminding you that your choices do not need validation from a single source. Role-playing and mental rehearsal can also prepare you for encounters with manipulative behaviors. Visualizing potential scenarios, such as a friend pressuring you to change plans, question your decisions, or use emotional cues allows you to practice assertive responses in a low-stakes environment. For instance, a young woman imagined how she would calmly respond if a friend tried to make her feel guilty for declining an invitation. When the actual situation occurred, she was able to respond confidently, minimizing emotional fallout. This proactive approach strengthens emotional resilience and reduces the likelihood of instinctive compliance to subtle influence. Another key strategy is recognizing and trusting your intuition. Often, our initial gut reactions detect subtle manipulation before conscious analysis catches up. For example, a student described feeling uneasy after a conversation with her friend. Even though nothing overtly controlling was said, she learned to trust that discomfort as a signal to pause, reflect, and evaluate the dynamics rather than dismissing it as overthinking. Intuition, combined with observation and documentation, creates a powerful early warning system that helps you respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Reframing the narrative is also effective. Manipulative friends frequently try to control how you perceive events, others, or even yourself. By consciously reframing situations from your own perspective, you reclaim mental space and reduce the influence of subtle control. For instance, if a friend criticizes your study habits, you can reinterpret it as a reflection of their preferences rather than an absolute truth about you. A real-life example involves a student whose friend consistently questioned her career choices. By mentally separating her friend's opinions from her own goals, she maintained motivation and made decisions aligned with her aspirations rather than their influence. Selective engagement is another practical method. You don't need to respond to every suggestion, critique, or emotional cue from a friend. Choosing when and how to engage preserves energy and focus, preventing the cumulative effect of subtle manipulation. One young man shared that he began mentally prioritizing his responses. If a comment or suggestion didn't serve his goals or well-being, he acknowledged it politely but did not internalize it. Over time, this reduced emotional manipulation while maintaining a cordial relationship. Finally, cultivating emotional resilience through self-care and self-validation reinforces autonomy. Manipulative friends often target insecurities, leveraging self-doubt to influence decisions. Regular practices such as journaling, meditation, affirmations, and pursuing independent goals strengthen self-confidence, reducing susceptibility to influence. In real life, individuals who invest in personal growth and maintain strong self-awareness report fewer instances of feeling coerced or obligated by friends' subtle tactics. Emotional resilience ensures that even when manipulative behaviors occur, they do not dictate your choices or erode your sense of self. Implementing these strategies, boundary setting, assertive communication, documentation, social diversification, role-playing, trusting intuition, reframing narratives, selective engagement, and cultivating emotional resilience creates a comprehensive approach to handling subtle manipulation in friendships. Real-life examples demonstrate that these methods work without severing connections or fostering resentment. Instead, they allow relationships to continue with balance, respect, and mutual understanding. Awareness, combined with proactive strategies, transforms friendships from potentially controlling dynamics into spaces of authentic support. Recognizing long-term manipulation in friendships requires paying attention to recurring patterns over months or even years, because subtle tactics rarely exist in isolation. In many real-life cases, what seems like harmless teasing or casual advice slowly evolves into a cycle of influence that shapes major decisions, self-perception, and even social interactions. One common pattern is the repeated undermining of confidence. For example, a young woman described her friendship with a college roommate who would consistently question her choices, from small daily decisions to bigger life plans. At first, she thought the roommate was just offering advice or joking around, but over time, she noticed that she hesitated before making decisions, constantly second-guessing herself. The cycle repeated whenever she attempted to assert independence. A suggestion, a remark, or a subtle critique would trigger self-doubt, followed by a gradual compliance with her friend's preferences. Long-term manipulation works precisely because it is incremental. Small nudges, repeated frequently, become internalized as normal, making it difficult to recognize without conscious reflection. Another long-term pattern is dependency creation. Manipulative friends often subtly encourage reliance by positioning themselves as indispensable to your social, emotional, or professional life. For instance, a man shared that his friend routinely reminded him that no one else understands you like I do, or implied that other friends might not be trustworthy. Initially, he ignored these remarks as casual statements of friendship, but over time, he found himself seeking this friend's approval for decisions that previously felt independent. Real-life examples like this demonstrate that manipulation is often less about direct control and more about shaping perception, creating an environment in which you feel reliant on the manipulator's guidance, subtly narrowing your world and reinforcing their influence. Manipulation also manifests in repetitive emotional cycles, often alternating between praise and criticism, approval and disapproval. One woman described a friendship where her friend would lavish praise when she aligned with their suggestions, only to withdraw attention or subtly criticize when she attempted to assert personal choices. This cyclical reinforcement conditions behavior over time. The desire for acceptance and affirmation becomes tied to compliance, and moments of disapproval create anxiety, prompting further alignment with the manipulator's expectations. Over months, this cycle produces predictable patterns where the manipulated individual subconsciously anticipates judgment or conditional approval, adjusting behavior even before any explicit manipulation occurs. The long-term effect is diminished self-confidence and an increased likelihood of acquiescing to subtle influence without conscious thought. Repetition of selective memory and narrative framing is another enduring pattern. Manipulative friends frequently reference past events in ways that reinforce their version of reality, while conveniently omitting facts that contradict their influence. For example, a student recounted how a friend repeatedly reminded her of previous mistakes to justify discouraging certain choices, while ignoring instances where she succeeded independently. Over years, this selective storytelling subtly rewrites personal history, making the individual question their judgment and perceive the manipulator as more reliable or knowledgeable. Long-term exposure to these patterns creates a distorted perspective where the manipulator's input is prioritized over personal instincts or alternative viewpoints. Even in situations where outside advice or objective evidence would normally guide, decision-making, subtle competition, and social comparison often emerge as recurring patterns as well. Manipulative friends can maintain control by positioning themselves as superior or more experienced in various areas, creating an ongoing sense of inadequacy. A young woman shared that her friend routinely highlighted achievements, possessions, or experiences that outshone her own, framing the comparisons as casual conversation or encouragement. Over time, she began to internalize these comparisons, feeling compelled to seek approval or validation through behavior that aligned with her friend's implicit expectations. This recurring cycle of social comparison reinforces the manipulator's influence, making independence feel uncomfortable or risky, and subtly directing life choices according to the manipulator's preferences. Long-term, manipulation can also be observed in patterns of isolation and gatekeeping. Many manipulative friends repeatedly suggest that other social connections are untrustworthy, uninterested, or incapable of understanding you. For example, a student described a friend who consistently undermined her relationships with classmates, subtly implying that spending time with others would be foolish or dangerous. Over years, She relied almost exclusively on this friend for social interaction and guidance, gradually narrowing her support network. Such cycles create dependency and reinforce influence because the manipulative friend remains the central figure in your decision-making and social life. Awareness of this recurring pattern is essential, as isolation is rarely abrupt. It develops gradually, and by the time it is noticeable, significant behavioral and emotional shifts may already have occurred. Another persistent pattern is repeated emotional guilt tripping. Manipulative friends frequently employ guilt to guide decisions, often using history, favors, or shared experiences as leverage. In one real-life example, a young woman described how her friend would regularly remind her of past sacrifices, both real and exaggerated, to secure compliance with new requests. The cycle often followed a predictable rhythm. The friend offered support, framed it as generosity, and later referenced that support to encourage decisions favorable to them. Over time, this pattern normalized the sense of obligation, making independent decision-making feel selfish or wrong. Recognizing these long-term cycles requires careful observation, as individual instances may appear benign, but the cumulative effect over months or years creates significant influence over behavior. Recurring passive-aggressive behavior is also a hallmark of long-term manipulation. A friend may consistently use subtle comments, jokes, or indirect criticism to shape choices and control perceptions. One young man shared that his friend frequently joked about his lifestyle, subtly suggesting laziness or poor judgment, while claiming to be humorous. These recurring comments gradually conditioned him to adjust his behavior to avoid further critique, even when the feedback was non-essential or irrelevant. Over time, passive-aggressive cycles create an environment where manipulation occurs without overt confrontation, allowing the manipulative friend to maintain influence while preserving the appearance of normal friendship. Additionally, long-term pattern recognition often reveals cycles of dependency, reinforcement, and occasional reward. Manipulators alternate between control and positive reinforcement, creating a psychological environment where compliance is rewarded and resistance is met with subtle disapproval. This strategy mirrors operant conditioning principles. Praise for conformity strengthens desired behaviors, while criticism or withdrawal discourages independent actions. In real-life accounts, students and young professionals described friendships where occasional praise or affection reinforced compliance with repeated patterns of subtle influence, conditioning them to align actions with the manipulator's expectations almost automatically. Over years, these cycles deeply affect self-esteem, decision-making, and even social orientation. Finally, long-term manipulation often escalates in parallel with life milestones. For example, a friend may gradually exert more influence as you make critical decisions, choosing colleges, careers, or romantic partners. One woman described how her friend initially influenced daily choices, but over time began framing major life decisions as risky unless she consulted or deferred to them. The manipulative patterns intensified, but always under the guise of concern, friendship, or guidance. Recognition of these recurring cycles allows you to intervene consciously, preventing long-term dependence and reclaiming autonomy without severing ties or fostering resentment. Understanding long-term manipulation cycles is not about blaming friends. It is about awareness, prevention, and preservation of self. Real-life examples show that individuals who actively reflect, document patterns, and set boundaries are able to disrupt these cycles while maintaining relationships. Recognizing recurrence, whether through repeated undermining of confidence. Isolation, emotional guilt, passive aggression, selective memory, or subtle competition empowers you to make informed choices. Instead of reacting impulsively or remaining unconsciously influenced, you can navigate friendships with clarity, assertiveness, and confidence, ensuring that relationships remain supportive rather than controlling. Building and maintaining friendships while preserving your independence is an essential skill, especially when you are aware of subtle manipulation patterns. Awareness alone is not enough. It must be paired with proactive strategies that protect your autonomy while allowing relationships to remain meaningful and mutually respectful. One of the most effective approaches is cultivating open, honest, and respectful communication. For example, if a friend habitually gives advice that nudges your decisions, calmly expressing your perspective can reduce subtle influence. A young woman shared that she told her friend, "I appreciate your suggestions, but I want to make this choice myself and learn from it." Initially, her friend was surprised and even slightly resistant, but over time, the friendship adjusted to include mutual respect for independent decision-making. This approach shows that assertiveness does not require confrontation or hostility. It simply communicates that your autonomy is valuable and non-negotiable. Another critical method is mutual boundary setting. Healthy friendships are built on understanding and respecting limits. For example, a college student realized that her friend often made plans without consulting her, expecting her to comply. She set a boundary by clearly stating her availability and preferred ways of planning, while also asking her friend about their expectations. Over time, this created a balanced dynamic where neither felt controlled, and both could maintain independence within the friendship. Real-life examples consistently demonstrate that boundaries are most effective when framed positively as a way to ensure both people's needs are respected rather than as punitive or critical measures. Consistency in self-awareness and reflection is another cornerstone of maintaining independence. Individuals who regularly evaluate their feelings, choices, and interactions are better equipped to recognize when manipulation may be creeping in. For instance, a young man described noticing a pattern where he would feel anxious after conversations with a particular friend. By reflecting on these moments, journaling, and comparing them with other social interactions, he identified subtle attempts to influence decisions. This allowed him to respond consciously rather than reactively, preserving both his emotional well-being and the friendship. Regular reflection creates a feedback loop. The more you understand your own responses, the less susceptible you become to external control, and the more authentic your interactions become. A practical strategy that works in daily life is gradual empowerment through small independent actions. Often, manipulators rely on patterns established over long periods, and breaking these cycles can feel uncomfortable at first. One young woman described starting with minor decisions, choosing her own study schedule, attending social events independently, or pursuing hobbies without her friends' input. Each small act of autonomy strengthened her confidence, making it easier to assert independence in larger areas, such as career choices or relationship decisions. Real-life examples confirm that gradual empowerment is more sustainable than sudden, dramatic changes, as it allows both parties to adjust without unnecessary conflict. Maintaining a diverse social network is another key factor. Manipulative friends often create subtle dependence by narrowing your social world or casting doubt on other relationships. Counteracting this by cultivating multiple connections ensures you have support and perspective outside a single friendship. For example, a young professional described how she reconnected with old classmates and family members while maintaining her friendship with someone who had previously influenced many of her decisions. This diversification gave her confidence to assert herself and reduced the emotional leverage the manipulative friend held. The principle is simple. Independence grows when your social environment is balanced, and influence is distributed rather than concentrated in one relationship. Practicing empathy and understanding without surrendering autonomy is also crucial. Manipulative friends often act out of insecurity, past experiences, or habitual behavior rather than intentional malice. Recognizing this allows you to respond with compassion while still protecting your boundaries. One real-life example involved a student whose friend frequently used guilt to influence decisions. Instead of retaliating or harboring resentment, she calmly acknowledged the friend's feelings, expressed her own perspective, and proceeded with her own choice. Over time, the friendship became more transparent, with both parties respecting each other's independence and emotional space. This approach reinforces the concept that awareness does not require hatred. It allows for kindness without sacrificing self-respect. Conflict resolution skills are another vital component. Subtle manipulation can lead to tension if left unchecked, but addressing it constructively strengthens the relationship. For instance, a young man described mediating a recurring pattern where his friend attempted to influence his social plans. By calmly discussing the situation, explaining his perspective, and negotiating mutually acceptable compromises, both maintained autonomy while improving trust and understanding. Real-life examples show that friendships would open. Constructive communication are less likely to devolve into repeated manipulation cycles. Because expectations are clarified and boundaries respected, self-validation and emotional resilience further support independence. Manipulative patterns often exploit self-doubt, so consistently affirming your values, decisions, and capabilities reduces vulnerability. For example, a woman regularly practiced affirmations and reflected on her accomplishments, which allowed her to recognize when her friends' comments were steering her choices rather than providing guidance. Real-life experiences show that emotionally resilient individuals navigate friendships more confidently, reducing the influence of subtle tactics such as guilt-tripping, selective praise, or passive-aggressive remarks. Another practical approach is mutual goal setting and shared expectations. Friends who manipulate often exploit unspoken assumptions about loyalty, availability, or shared priorities. By discussing expectations openly, such as how often to hang out, how to offer advice, or how to handle disagreements, you create a framework for balanced interaction. One young woman explained that after setting clear expectations with her friend regarding advice and decisions, the frequency of subtle manipulative behaviors decreased, because both parties understood the boundaries and were accountable to the agreed framework. Finally, maintaining independence in friendships requires continuous awareness, reflection, and adaptation. Subtle manipulation can appear in cycles or evolve over time, so vigilance is necessary. Real-life examples consistently show that individuals who combine observation, documentation, assertiveness, and empathy can sustain meaningful friendships without sacrificing autonomy. Awareness is not static. It's a skill developed through repeated practice and mindful engagement. It allows you to enjoy the support, trust, and companionship of friends while ensuring your choices, emotions, and personal growth remain your own. In conclusion, friends can manipulate without overt malice, using subtle influence that often masquerades as care, humor, or guidance. From small comments and emotional cues to long-term cycles of dependency, selective praise, and social leverage, manipulation operates incrementally, shaping decisions, self-esteem, and social dynamics. Awareness is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy, but it must be paired with practical strategies, reflection, boundary setting, assertive communication, selective engagement, social diversification, empathy, and emotional resilience. Real-life examples demonstrate that these strategies are effective, allowing individuals to navigate friendships with clarity, maintain independence, and foster healthier, balanced relationships by recognizing recurring patterns, responding proactively, and reinforcing boundaries. You can transform friendships from spaces of subtle control into authentic, mutually supportive connections. Awareness does not breed hatred. It fosters understanding, self-respect, and empowerment. Subtle manipulation, once visible, loses its power. You can preserve meaningful friendships, protect your emotional well-being, and make decisions aligned with your values, while still enjoying companionship, shared experiences, and trust. Awareness, combined with conscious action, is the key to thriving in friendships without surrendering autonomy, ensuring that your connections enrich your life rather than compromise it. Friendship is meant to be a source of support, trust, and joy. Yet, subtle manipulation can quietly shape our choices, self-esteem, and social dynamics without us realizing it. The goal of this video was not to make you hate your friends, but to empower you with awareness. By observing patterns, setting boundaries, communicating assertively, and maintaining emotional resilience, you can navigate friendships with clarity and confidence, realizing that manipulation can exist in small, everyday actions allows you to protect your autonomy while preserving meaningful connections. Remember, awareness is strength, and independence is not isolation. It's the foundation of healthy, authentic friendships. Stay mindful, trust yourself, and nurture relationships that respect both your freedom and theirs. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to reflect on your friendships today.